So, Michael, so you were you were you were fine with doing the interview.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Looking forward to this.
now the thing is, of course, that I should have prepared some questions, but actually I thought it would probably come while we speak. So if you could um if you could just introduce yourself a bit, who you are. I mean, I guess most people know, but maybe some people don't. So.
Well, I'm Michael Tomczyk. I'm the manager of the Mac Center for Technological Innovation at Wharton School in
Mhm.
Philadelphia, part of the University of Pennsylvania. I've been
Okay.
there almost 17 years, but I guess I'm best known for my role in the development and launch of the first home computer. I've been called the marketing father of the home computer.
Uh
I
huh.
don't know if
Uh huh.
that's accurate or not. There were lots of people involved, but that's,
Mhm.
I guess, my claim to fame.
And I wrote, I read on that Commodore book that I think that was Commodore, a company on the edge, that you were actually called the right hand of Jack Tramiel, right?
Well,
Kind
I
of.
was very lucky. I arrived at Commodore just at the moment that
Mhm.
Jack was starting to think about developing a home computer, what he called for the masses, not the classes.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I sort of stumbled into his office looking for a job at the same time he was looking for someone like me. And we
Mhm.
became a very powerful duo, I guess.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you he hired me as assistant to the president, and but he told me my role would not be to assist him. My role would be to follow him around and learn everything I could, and then we do something. And it turned out that the first day was in London, where he
Mhm.
announced he wanted to do a new home computer.
Mhm.
The second week was in Germany, where he asked the German government to
Mhm.
give
Mhm.
him a factory so he could
Mhm.
manufacture computers there. And the third week we came back, and
Mhm.
he told me to look at the marketing department, and we fired the marketing department. So I must say it was a trial by fire.
That factory was in Braunschweig, right?
Yes.
And that first computer was the VIC 20.
Well, yes. When I first joined Jack, I had job offers from Atari and Apple.
Mhm.
I did know Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and I used to hang out at Apple all the time. I was general manager of a small company doing special effects for motion pictures. We
Mhm.
did Time After Time and Logan's Run and some science fiction classics. And then one day, Atari, which was one of our clients, gave us a beta test site, made us a beta test site for the Atari 600 computer. It
Mhm.
was kind of a game computer, and it had a really interesting game called Star Raiders.
Mhm.
So we started playing that game, and I swear I couldn't get anybody to stop playing it, so I took it home. Three
Uh-huh.
nights later, I looked up at the curtains, and there was a thin stream of light coming in through the curtains, and
Mhm.
said, "Oh my God, I've been up all night, 3 nights in a row, without any sleep, playing this stupid game." So I figured if somebody is, I was kind of serious-minded, and if somebody
Mhm.
like me could get hooked on
Mhm.
computers, the whole world was going to be hooked on computers.
Yes, and that was at a
So
time where people said it would never have a future, those computers for the masses, right?
yes, a short time later, I quit my job.
Mhm.
I started living on my savings.
Mhm.
I took 6 months off. I took basic programming classes. There were so few computers in computer stores that one night we would work on an Apple, and the next night we would work on a Commodore because they didn't have enough to go around. So I became ambidextrous in terms of using computers and basic programming. So I had been a journalist in college. I had been in the
Mm.
Army also, and I was a
Mhm.
public information officer in the Army, and I was a Vietnam veteran, and did a lot
Mhm.
of writing for Stars and Stripes and Associated Press and
Mhm.
Time
Mhm.
Magazine and many other places. So, I started doing stories for computer magazines, and one of the stories I did was on that Star Raiders game that got me
Mhm.
hooked on computers. And then I went down to Apple and I started hanging around there and did some stories on Apple. And the next thing I knew, I was walking into Apple anytime I wanted. They had security badges, but I didn't have to wear a security badge because I just kind of walked in, and they always got mad at me for that. But I would walk straight back to where Steve Wozniak was working with
Mhm.
Andy Hertzfeld, who were they were working on the Mac and some of the early Apple systems.
Mhm.
And so, to make a long story short, I decided to get a job in computers. I had a job offer from Apple, which was they basically said one day, go in the cafeteria, look at the job requests, and pick out the job that you're suited for. And it looked so stringent to me. It looked very, very formal for a place like Apple. Besides,
Mhm.
they had too many geniuses.
Mhm.
So that's a place you get lost at. And in terms of if you think about fables, they were the Papa Bear. And then there was the
Mhm.
baby bear, which was Atari, and I went to Atari and I was offered a job as software manager or director
Mhm.
of software.
Mhm. Mhm.
Turned that job down because they didn't seem like they had it together. They didn't quite
Mhm.
get it. And it turns out that Atari lost $1 billion in 5 years.
Mm.
So then I went to Commodore and I got myself an interview with Jack Tramiel, who was the
Mhm.
founder.
Mhm.
Jack was a 6 year survivor of Auschwitz,
Mhm.
extremely ruthless, tough guy.
Mhm.
Um, did not hold a grudge against Germany for what happened to him. He basically was more forgiving than a lot of people,
Mhm.
and he
Mhm.
just wanted to get on with his life. And one day I asked him how he dealt with
Mhm.
all the problems of the Holocaust, 6 years in Auschwitz, and he said, "I live in the future."
Mhm.
So that became
Very
my
smart.
sort of mantra.
Mhm.
And so in the first meeting with Jack, he asked me, "What do you know about Commodore?" And I said, "I don't know much about Commodore, but I heard from a lot of people that know you that they seem to think you're some kind of a crook. But I figure if you're not in prison, you're not a crook, you're just a shrewd businessman, and I'd like to learn how to be shrewd like that." And
Very smart.
if that sounds peculiar to you, I practiced that little speech 2 hours in front of the mirror to make sure I wouldn't blow it because I
So
didn't want to
things,
tell him.
so things weren't so much different back then than nowadays.
Yeah. So then I told him what he said. What do you think about the company? And I told him about 20 or 30 things that I think were wrong. Lousy marketing,
Oh, okay.
documentation, no communication with user clubs,
Uh huh.
great hardware but not properly advertised, and all kinds of other
Oh,
things.
okay.
And he said, "Well, I normally can't hire people to learn the religion." What he called his philosophy of business the religion.
Mhm. Mhm.
So he said, I normally don't hire people to do this, but I just lost my assistant, and I might have the luxury to be able to do that now.
Mhm.
So he said, call me
Mhm.
tomorrow, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do with you.
Okay. Perfect.
So
So you didn't know what you're doing, but you are hired actually.
kind of, but not
Uh.
really. So I called the next day 11 times. Every time the secretary would say, "Jack's in a meeting. Jack's going to get back to you. Jack's gone to lunch. Jack didn't decide what he wanted to do with you yet. Jack needs a little more time. He'll call you right back. Give him 5 minutes." All day long this went on. It was horrible and very frustrating. Finally, 7 o'clock at night, I made my 11th phone call. And everybody was gone from the company, but Jack happened to walk by the secretary's desk. He picked up the phone and he said, "Yes." And I said, "It's Michael." And he said, "Oh, Michael, I decided what I'm going to do with you. Come over and I'll tell you." And so, on the last phone call, I promised myself if nobody answered the call or Jack didn't respond, the next day I'm working for Apple. And,
Okay.
and I
Okay.
nothing they can do can bring me back.
Okay.
Well, so that's just by serendipity. I wound up working for Commodore. So Jack told
Mhm.
me, "I'm going to make you assistant to the president."
Okay,
But
perfect.
your job is not to assist me. Your job is to follow me around, learn the religion, and
Mhm.
uh, you can start. And then we decided that I would start the first day would be April 1st,
Mhm.
1980, which was
Mhm.
April Fool's Day,
Yeah, of course.
which was very ironic. And I met Jack at a country estate in London where 20 or 30 gurus from the company,
Mhm.
general managers, a
Mhm.
couple of software experts, a marketing guru named Kit Spencer from the UK, Harold Speyer from Germany, the general manager, wonderful guy.
Mhm.
And so Jack told the group, which was seated around a big square table, he said, "Gentlemen, I want to have a new small color computer. We want to make computers for the
Mhm.
masses, not the
Mhm.
classes."
Mhm. Mhm.
Everybody disagreed. Everybody. They said, "We need to make business computers. We need to squeeze more profit
Mhm.
from the market before we go
Mhm.
cost." And
Mhm.
they were working on a high-end color computer, which was the darling of the engineering department.
Mhm.
So one thing led to another, and Jack left, and the next day he came back, and there were three or four people who wanted the new computer. One
Mhm.
was the general manager and the marketing guru Kit Spencer from the UK.
Oh yes.
Another one was Tony Tokai and his
Mhm.
software engineer from Japan. And the last one was me. And
Mhm.
everybody else was against it. So Jack heard everybody's arguments, and when he was
Mhm.
done, he stood up, he pounded his fist once on the table, and he said, "Gentlemen, the Japanese are coming, so we will become the Japanese." He had a
Perfect.
much deeper voice than me, like very, very deep. And when he
Mhm.
talked, the room actually vibrated. He was very, very powerful. He was short, bald, a little bit round, and had a personality that was very, 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 very intense. And he laughed just as hard as he swore when he was angry. But he was like work. It was like working for General Patton. He
Mhm.
was a very strong-minded, or a
Mhm. Mhm.
somebody who's very, very strong-willed.
Mhm.
So the bottom line was that we came back after we went to Germany, and he said, "I'd like to buy a factory there that is going bankrupt. So find me a failing factory and I'll rescue it and we'll make computers there." And the German officials said, "Why should we do that?" And he said, "Number one, because you owe it to me, because I was in Auschwitz. And number two, it'd be great PR for you."
Mhm.
And then he said, "Finally, we will become the center of manufacturing for Commodore in Europe." And they said, "Okay, that sounds reasonable." Jack went to Braunschweig. He
Mhm.
met with people. There were about 112 people there, or 106 people, and he explained what was going on. And he said, "I understand if anybody doesn't want to work for a Jew who was in Auschwitz." And six people walked out, and the rest of them stayed and became very loyal and
Mhm.
wonderful
Mhm. Mhm.
employees. Jack told me later, I'll just tell you something funny. Jack told me later that he didn't think Germany killed the Jews. He said it was the rules that killed the Jews. And that was a very odd thing, but he said he thought the German people were very, very dedicated to following the rules
Mhm.
of the organization, of the infrastructure of the government.
Mhm.
And if madmen or insane people are making the rules, then that's what they do. So that was his philosophy, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he was very forgiving, and that's why he did business in Germany so
Mhm.
successfully.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so anyway, we came back to the United States, and then we the first week he told me to go check out the marketing department. I went to the marketing department. I came back. Went to the marketing department. I came back to talk to Jack. Finally, I went to lunch one day, and I came back, and all 12 offices are empty. So I asked the secretary, who was looking down at her pad, and she was writing like this. And I asked her, "Where is everybody?" And she said, "Jack came by and fired them just before lunch."
Woo. Okay.
I said, "All of them?" She said, "Yes." And she didn't look up at me. She was just very calmly writing something. And I said, "You don't seem upset. Does this happen very often?" And she said, well, actually, yes, it does.
Pretty nice. Yeah,
So
well.
I ran to Jack's office, and I said, Jack, what happened? And he said, well, you said you didn't like the marketing department, so I fired them. And I said, no, no. It wasn't quite that simple. And he said, no, I've been thinking about this for some time, and so here's the deal. He said, you go hire a new marketing department,
Mhm.
everybody you think we need, and I'll hire a marketing vice president, and we'll divide up the tasks that way.
Mhm. Mhm.
Jack was very cool, by the way. Jack, I made a deal with Jack that I could eavesdrop on any phone calls or sit in on any meetings, which later allowed me to write my book, which is The Home Computer Wars,
Which
which
became
is
very
very
successful.
popular.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, my book is out of print now. You can find a few copies on Amazon.com, but I'm getting ready to republish that as an ebook this year, and I hope to do that in different languages as well. So
Perfect.
this year everyone seems to be interested in my story because of the untimely death of Steve Jobs. There aren't many of us left who were pioneers in those
Mhm.
days who can
Mhm.
tell the inside story, and I guess my book is one of the few inside stories.
So do you consider yourself famous?
No, I'm very humbled when people contact me, but I have to tell you honestly, every month or so, somebody, mostly from Europe now, writes me an email saying, thank you for getting me into computers. It changed my career.
Mhm.
And I gave 4 or 5 interviews in Austria, Italy, Poland has me on the cover of a magazine this
Uh huh.
month.
Ooh.
Somebody from Romania asked me if they could translate
Mhm.
my biography into Romanian.
Mhm.
So I think I owe it to everyone to republish the story of the home computer wars,
Mhm.
add some more material, and
Mhm.
then maybe put it in some different languages.
Okay.
Is that fame?
So.
I don't know. I had my 15 minutes of fame. That's fine.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, and how do you think about this fact that actually the text version of that interview is going to be published in a C64 diskette magazine? I guess that's quite fitting, isn't it?
Yes. I'm just very humbled by how many people trace their roots back to the first home computers, because what we were
Mhm.
trying to do with the home computer was make it affordable for everyone, so that everyone in kindergarten and high school and
Mhm.
colleges could, or even at home, could learn computing, and that was the beginning of home computing. In those days, we were all talking about the home computer revolution, but it hadn't occurred yet, and everybody was asking, when will it happen? Everybody was asking, when will we have friendly computers, because computers were not seen as friendly. So one of the things that happened after we came back that changed my life, I used to be a journalist when I started out, as I said.
Mhm.
So I wrote all of my ideas for the new computer into a memo. It was about a 30-page single-spaced memo. I typed using word processing on Commodore computers. I typed very fast. I guess I type about 85 words a minute.
Mhm.
So when I was done with my memo, I had the name, the price, the features, and I drew a big happy face on the cover with a beard and mustache. And that became my trademark ever since. And I took it and I threw it on Jack's desk. And Jack said, what's this? And I said, that everything should be done with a new computer. Make sure whoever's in charge does it. So about a week later, Jack came and threw my memo back on my desk. And I said, what's this? And he said, that's everything should be done with a new computer. Make sure it happens. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I've given everybody instructions that they have to put anything involving the new computer by you and get your approval. And he
Oh,
said,
okay.
yeah. And then he said, this isn't going to be easy because none of the people involved report to you. So you're going to have to use persuasion, your personality, and the authority that you have working for me to make these things happen. And to my delight, and thank goodness, everyone went along with that. And the only thing that happened when I talked to engineers, when I talked to people in Japan, when I talked to the teams that were working on this, they asked me what should we do, and I said there is only one prime directive. And I don't know if you remember Star Trek, but the Star Trek always had the prime directive:
Yes, I know.
don't mess with the aliens, you know. So my prime directive was this must be user friendly. So everybody knew immediately what I meant by that. And so as a result,
Mhm.
we wound up with a computer that had a full-size typewriter keyboard, which I had to fight for. Everybody wanted a membrane keyboard because it cost a lot
Mhm.
less money and made our profits higher. I went to Japan and I saw an NEC 5000, PC 5000 prototype, which had function keys, but that was selling for $600 or $700. It hadn't been released yet. So I stole that idea from NEC, and we put programmable function keys on the VIC-20. We put an RS-232 interface built into the computer, which meant we could connect it to directly to a telephone line and have like telecomputing, which we were one of the first to do that. And we had a lot of other features built in. We had cartridges for games and cartridges for memory expansion and IEEE port and all kinds of things that helped make this. We even developed later on a speech module which made the computer talk, which was very groundbreaking. So one thing led to another, and the next thing I knew, I was working on this. A lot of the work was done by an engineer in Japan named Yash
Mhm.
Terakura,
Mhm.
who still is active and consulting and doing things, and he's one of the godfathers of the software. Many of the semiconductor chips were already designed for the larger computer, and they were adapted for this. One was called the VIC chip, the video interface chip. When it came time to name the computer, I decided to call it the VIC. First of all, I wanted to call it the Commodore Spirit because Commodore had entered Europe quite early. In the 1970s, we sold digital calculators there, and then
Mhm.
in the 80s, business computers. So a lot of people remembered Commodore, and in many cases, Commodore was the number one computer company in Europe, but number three in the US. And Apple had not come to Europe in a big way
Mhm.
yet.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I said, let's continue that reputation and call this the Commodore Spirit. Well, we were almost ready to go with the Commodore Spirit when all of a sudden I got a frantic telex. Isn't this weird? I had to get telexes instead of emails because we didn't have email. So I got a frantic telex from Japan. Cannot use, cannot use Spirit. Stop. I must use something else. Stop. Spirit in Japan means ghoulish, horrible, soul-eating creature from hell. It doesn't mean Casper the Friendly Ghost. So, or some friendly ghost. So the bottom line was, I said, let's call it the Vic, but let's put the number 20 after it.
Mhm.
20 means nothing.
Mhm.
20 has no relationship to anything. And when Jack asked me, well, why are you calling it the Vic 20? And I said, because 20 is a friendly number. And he said, oh, okay. And he accepted that. That's the honest to God truth. The reason is, I said, well, Vic sounds like a truck driver's name. You
Mhm.
know, Vic the truck driver, and you can't have that in a little small computer. So we had to put a number over after it to make it sound.
Mhm.
So it became Vic 20 instead of Vic.
But the interesting story here is that in Germany it was renamed to the VC 20,
Yeah,
VC 20, because the VIX sounds like the F word in German.
yeah, I heard that, and that's so in Germany it became the VC 20, and in Japan it became the Vic 1001 because
Mhm.
at that time there was a famous movie called 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Mhm.
So the Japanese wanted to call it the Vic 1001, and I think that was very smart. It was
Mhm.
introduced in Japan first, by the way,
Mhm.
at a small department store just to see what would happen all day long at this department store, Seibu department store in Tokyo. the engineers from the other companies in Japan, Seiko and Sony, they were all coming around our booth with screwdrivers. And we kept wondering, why are they here? And then whenever we turned our back, they were trying to unscrew the case and look inside and see what they could steal and find out how we did this. So we had to chase them away constantly, but it was introduced in Japan first, and then in the U.S., and then overseas. We used advertising materials from Europe, from Germany and England, which had the best advertising agencies. So we had very colorful graphics against a silver background and a rainbow motif, and it was very, very, very cool. If you know anything about Club Med and the French designs there, if you go to, I haven't been to a Club Med for many years, but they always had very bright T-shirts and clothes. The color of the drawers behind you there, I'm looking at you on the video now, but bright colors, and that's what Europe is sort of known for in design. So we use those bright colors to sell the VIC-20. We also used, when we did the second version, the second iteration, which was the Commodore 64, we used William Shatner from Star Trek to do our advertising.
That's actually a good question. How did you happen to get him to make the advertising for you?
Well, so along the line, we realized that the VIC-20 was the first million-seller microcomputer. And we realized that, and Commodore actually became the first billion-dollar personal computer company. We were 6 months ahead of Apple in reaching the billion-dollar mark. So we realized that we had to start being a grown-up company. We couldn't act like a wildcat oil rig company. We had to be more serious. One of the things you do when you become more serious is you have a more formal marketing and advertising department, like a vice president advertising. You also, most corporations spend about 6% of their revenues on advertising. We found ways to spend less. We found very sneaky ways to go on television, and when somebody canceled a contract, or when there was some leftover time available, that's the time we bought to show our TV ads. So we never paid full price for any of our TV ads. And then because we had all this extra money, we could afford to hire William Shatner.
Oh, okay.
So and William Shatner was William Shatner was a little bit disgusted. After he left Star Trek, he didn't do advertising for a high-tech company. He did advertising for Promise margarine, a butter substitute.
Okay.
He told me that was one of his great regrets, that he did that instead of doing something high-tech. So he was very happy about that. But when we took him to the studio the first time, I was there as liaison, and we tried to dress him up like Captain Kirk with a sweater that looked like that. And he said, no. He said, you can't make me look like Captain Kirk. It will be a conflict of interest. So we had to get him a different style sweater. And somebody had to run outside and run up and down the street and find some sweaters to bring back. And he had to try on these sweaters until he got the right one. But he still looked like Captain Kirk.
Yes, I saw the advertisement. He still looks like that. Yeah, indeed.
And the funny thing was that when I sat him down at the computer, I have a picture of me showing him the computer. And he told me that's the first time he ever worked with a real computer because they're all fake on Star Trek. So his first, Captain Kirk from Star Trek's first computer was actually a Commodore, and I have a picture of me showing it to him. So I showed Captain Kirk his first computer, which is a big kick for me, even after all these years.
Great. So we spoke about William Shatner.
There was a lot of interesting stuff going on with advertising. One of the first things I did when we launched the VIC-20, I recruited a small group of programmers to do some software and to support the first computer. So basically, I had about 5 or 6 people, and they were all about 18 to 23 years of age. One of them was a salesman at Radio Shack. Another one was taught himself machine language programming, and some of them were hobbyists from user clubs. It was very interesting. So I got them together, but they were also young, and we had an open bay office system. So people kept stealing our computers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they kept stealing our computers. Oops, sorry.
No problem. No problem.
Uh, Mudget the Wonder Dog here. This is Mudget.
Hello.
Oh, let's see if we can see. There you are.
No
Okay,
problem.
say hi for a minute. This is
Hello.
Mudget. This is a
Hello,
white.
Matchett.
This is a white Pomeranian, and
Nice. Now the video will get higher clicks on YouTube
oh,
because
I'm sure.
everybody wants to see the dog.
Say hi, Mudget. She's the best. So,
Great.
so like I said, the advertising was very interesting. Um, so anyway, back
They
to
were
the story about
they were
the Vic
stealing your
Commandos.
computers. You said.
Yeah, so they were stealing. So what happened was, I'll do this over so you can edit it. Um, yeah, because the my team was all very young and a little bit inexperienced, people kept sneaking in and stealing our computers and taking them to conventions. We didn't have enough, so they would steal the business computers that we were using to do machine language. Now, sometimes you would do software in machine language or something
Mhm.
called assembly language, and
Mhm.
sometimes it would have to run for 24 hours to compile it. It was
Mhm.
very slow. Now these are things we do instantaneously. We were doing overnight.
Mhm.
So if the computer disappeared while something was compiling, we were set back many days in our
Mhm.
development. We were writing games and software and all sorts
Mhm.
of stuff,
Mhm.
manuals. So one day, one of our guys, his father owned an advertising specialties company, and
Mhm.
he brought in a big brass coin about this big
Mhm.
and about the size of a silver dollar. And so I said, he gave one to everyone, and it said, good luck, and something on it, and some other words. And I said, this is our new symbol. And I said, furthermore, we're going to call ourselves the Vic Commandos. Because
Oh.
I was a captain in the Army, and I was in Vietnam, and I was also, I had a lot of experience. I experienced combat, and I had a lot of experiences. So I was in the airborne. I jumped out of airplanes and helicopters, and that was
Mhm.
fun. So I said, we're going to be the Vic Commandos. I had been to jungle school in Panama, so I thought that was a good motif for us. So I
Mhm.
took my little commando group into the hallway, and I started flipping this coin. In the old gangster movies, there's a actor named George Raft who used to flip a coin, and
Mm.
it's kind of a famous gangster motif from the 1930 movies. And so I would flip this coin, and pretty soon we all learned how to flip these coins, and we could flip them up with our thumb and catch them over and over again to make ourselves look a little
Mm.
tougher.
Mm.
So I said in a very loud voice, I'm tired of everybody stealing our computers, so the next person that steals a computer from our bay for any reason is going to be fired, and I'll make sure of it. Just like that. And of course, I didn't have the authority to fire anybody, but everybody was so afraid of that nobody ever stole another computer from our bay.
Well, you could have said to Jack you don't like him, and then he would fire him for you, I guess.
No, no, no. Actually, in reality, we had a very strange structure at Commodore.
Mhm.
We had something that I call the infrastructure.
Mhm.
Jack called it the family.
Okay.
And here's how it works. Anybody who was in this sort of in group, who kind of got the philosophy, which he called the religion, if we saw something terribly wrong, we were expected to act on it, even if it meant firing somebody who outranked us.
Mhm.
And I had many, many stories of people in the company that fired people who were actually ranking higher than them simply because they were kind of screwing up something.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't have to do that, but there were a lot of instances where I had more authority than most vice presidents,
Mhm.
even though I didn't have a vice president title.
Mhm.
So basically, when we became the Vic Commandos, we started flipping these coins, and we started doing different things. And just 1 second.
Mhm.
So um, one of the things we did was I got a terrific note from the editor of Byte magazine who told me that there aren't many people who are waving the flag for user friendliness. And this was a new concept in those days. I was one of the people that was a major flag waver for this. We went to the Consumer Electronics show one year, and I was the co-keynote speaker, and I shared the stage with Bill Gates,
Mhm.
which shows how important Commodore was at the time.
Mhm.
So this editor sent me this note, and he said, "Did you know there's a word for user friendliness, and it's Benutzerfreundlichkeit?"
Yes, exactly.
And I said, "You're kidding!" So I immediately ran out, and I had wooden plaques with wooden plaques with brass plates on it that said Benutzerfreundlichkeit, official motto of the Vic Commando team. And so basically that became our motto. By the way, I'm just taking a toy away from my dog. Mudget has a little dog a toy that sounds like a frog, and so when she bites it, it goes ribbit ribbit. So
Ah, okay, okay.
had to stop that. She just wants some attention. She wants to be on the internet. So anyway, Benutzer Freundlichkeit became literally the official motto of the Vic Commando team and our whole program. Then one day, somebody came in and showed me a new Atari game computer, and it had a slogan on the box: "Computers for People."
Mhm.
And I said, "Computers for People? That's very generic. Can they trademark that?" Because it had a little trademark after it. And the lawyer said, "Sure." So I said, well, darn, if they're going to do computers for people, I'm going to trademark the friendly computer.
Mhm.
So I actually asked our lawyers to trademark the friendly computer. So that had two interesting things. First of all, it identified our computer as friendly. Secondly, it prevented almost all of our competition from calling their computers friendly.
Oh, perfect.
So not only did we become user-friendly, but we became legally user-friendly. These are the kinds of innovations we were doing.
Perfect, perfect.
Another thing I did was I bought the back page of all the computer magazines, so it looked like we owned those computer magazines. Every time you picked up a computer magazine, you saw a Commodore ad on the back cover.
Ah, okay.
We did a lot of things like that.
But it didn't influence Germany so much, right? Because I remember that in the book there was written that Commodore Germany was totally different, for example. So, so Jack preferred to keep those Commodore quarters in other countries separately.
Well, every country had a very strong general manager. In
Okay.
Germany, it was Harold Speyer, and they had a lot of freedom to market the computer the way they thought they should. In the UK, it was Bob Gleadow and Kit Spencer. In
Mhm.
Japan, it was Tony Tokai, and they
Mhm.
had very strong personalities. And I worked very closely with both Kit Spencer and Harold Speyer. When we had that when we had that meeting in the first meeting on my first day in London to talk about the new computer. This was like a general business meeting to plan strategy. And so when uh, I had an opportunity, I would take each of the general managers aside for 10 or 15 minutes and get to know them and tell them, if you need anything from the U.S., contact me and I'll make sure it happens. So for my whole 5 years at Commodore, I had people calling me constantly, and they were always saying nice things about me because if they needed something done, they knew they could
Mhm.
call me and make it
Mhm.
happen. And it's a secret of anybody's success. If you work in a multinational company today, that's what you have to do. And I guess I was doing it pretty early, but I recognized immediately that you need to have a network in place.
Mhm.
So, by the way, I can tell you a great story from Germany that involves Harold Speyer.
Yeah, tell me. Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, we went to Hanover Messe several times. And my first time at Hanover Fair, they had a big giant office computing complex, and they had a farm complex and all those giant buildings, as you know. And so I kept seeing these beautiful girls walking by. I was single at the time. They had
Mm-hmm.
these beautiful girls walking by with these, carrying these trays with beer and pork hocks and sauerkraut. And that looked so good to me because I come from Wisconsin, and in Wisconsin we have German and Polish and Italian people are Swedish, and so I thought that looked delicious. And Harold kept promising to take me to the beer hall to have that. So one day we did that, and we went to have those pork hocks, and he ordered a beer. The beer he ordered was like 1 liter, a
Mm-hmm.
1 liter, which was big in those days. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for Americans. And so he took the beer and he just starts downing it like blah 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 blah, and it's all gone immediately. And I said, "Oh my God, I guess this is German culture. I better keep up, you know." So I drank the beer and I drank it down, and he said, "Okay, another one." And pretty soon we had like about 3 liters of beer,
Oh
and I
Jesus.
was getting a little wobbly. And I'm talking to Harold, and I said, "Harold, I mean, I come from Wisconsin. My little hometown only had 50,000 people, but at one time when I was a child, we had 4 breweries in my town. We had a very strong German contingent in our town, and we had a lot of German culture growing up. So Harold looked at me and he said, "Well, when I was in the beer Olympics, we used to drink much more than this." And I said, "What? Wait, whoa, wait a minute. You were in the beer Olympics?" And he said, "Yeah, I was a champion in the beer Olympics." And I went, "Oh my God, I'm sitting here trying to keep pace with a champion from the beer Olympics." So I was so wobbly after that lunch. Harold went back to work as if nothing happened, and I had to stay away from the booth the whole day. I learned about farm machines and grass and planting wheat indoors and all kinds of weird things that were on display at the Hanover Fair. I stayed totally away from computers the whole day until I sobered up.
Okay. Yeah, well. So that's the thing.
But Harold was one of the primary drivers in Japan, in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
of the not only manufacture as our manufacturing center, our marketing in Germany. He helped make Commodore a household name in Germany, and which is, I guess, why we're still doing these interviews all these many years later. So I want to give a tribute to Harold Speyer, who just absolutely terrific manager and a true professional. Despite
Yes.
and a beer champion.
Yes. Well, you're right. 2 years ago, I met an ex-German sales manager from Commodore, and he was pretty much willing to tell me stories
Oh,
about his time in Commodore Germany. So people of Commodore seem to be very liking to answer questions, which leads me to the question: how come that all the info about Jack is only given by one of his sons actually? Why he is never doing interviews personally? Why he is letting his son doing it?
Jack was very gun shy. Jack was treated very badly by the
Okay.
press.
Mhm.
Uh, Jack was short, chubby, balding.
Mhm.
He was very forceful. He said things that he just the way just as he felt them. He
Mhm.
was passionate, and a lot of people thought he was a little bit too blunt or too forthright.
Mhm.
Some people resented his success,
Mhm.
um, and I think he had a off and on love-hate relationship with the press.
Mhm.
He was
Mhm.
often treated badly by them. Early in his career, there were some associates in Canada that had some financial problems, and Commodore was associated with that, and as I understand, unfairly. Jack told me once when he was in doing business in Canada, he woke up one morning and they were saying nasty things about him in the newspapers that his
Oh.
children had to read, and he was technically bankrupt.
Mhm.
So I said, "What did you do?"
Mhm.
And he said, I went to Europe, and I talked to some bankers, and I got some money, and I had to decide, should I stay down
Mhm.
and accept this, or should I get back on my horse and keep going? And
Mhm.
he decided
Mhm.
to get back on the horse.
Mhm.
In fact, one day we used to have lunch quite a bit, and we used to walk
Mhm.
down to a delicatessen. And here he was, a multimillionaire, sitting having a sandwich at a deli, at a counter. And I asked him, "What's the most important business lesson you ever learned?" And he
Mhm.
looked at me, he glared, and he said, "Banks will negotiate."
Mhm.
He said, when I went to Europe to look for money, when I was almost bankrupt, technically bankrupt, he said, I closed the door, and as soon as I closed the door, everybody started negotiating. And that stayed with me my whole career, he said.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think that was a very strong thing. There were some other lessons. Do you know the TV series MASH?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Radar O'Reilly is walking behind the colonel like a little puppet, walking behind him all the time, echoing his words and saying the words before he speaks.
Mhm. Mhm.
I was Radar O'Reilly to Jack.
Mhm. Ah, okay.
I was following him around with a notepad, taking notes and writing and talking and
Mhm.
making ideas
Mhm.
and brainstorming in the hallway, on the move, while we were talking. Sometimes Jack would come and we would get in my little car. I had a company car, and we would
Mhm.
drive to New York, and he would drive because he used to be a taxi driver in New York once upon a
Mhm.
time. Well, one day I was walking down the hall, and I asked Jack, how should I do a software contract? I want to standardize all of our software contracts because they have all lapsed,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that's why we fired the marketing department. By the way, we actually had reasons, and
Okay.
all of our software contracts had lapsed, and there were some other things. So I asked Jack. I said, Jack, what do you want me to do with these software contracts? I would like to do a standard contract and to have a couple of addendums at the end with any special features. And Jack turned and looked at me, and he said, I want you should have sex.
Mhm.
And then he turned and walked away. Now, I had some of my little Vic Commandos with me, and they said, what did that mean? What was that? And I said, well, that's very obvious. When you have sex, it's always pretty much mechanically the same, but it's always a different experience. That's the same with software contracts. And
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
so I knew exactly what he meant. He didn't have to say anything more to me. He
Mhm.
just had to
Mhm.
say, "Why you should have sex." He didn't mean go have sex. He meant the software contract has to be negotiated individually every time, so that it's a unique and valuable experience, and that we get the best deal. And so later on, um, we actually did standardize the software contracts,
Mhm.
but that was his first reaction. Some other interesting things happened when sometimes we'd be in a meeting, and Jack would be yelling and swearing, and a couple times he fired vice presidents in meetings because they weren't doing what they promised. And whenever he was yelling at me, I would lean forward, and this is called enfilade in the army. If you lean forward and people are shooting at you, the bullets go over your head. So you kind of lean forward into the fire. And whenever anybody asks me, how come you never get fired? Because you've had some very strong conversations with Jack, and he could have fired you easily. And I said, well, you just lean into the anger, lean into it. Like when Jack would say, "You really screwed up," and I'd say, "Well, yes, I certainly did," and then he just stopped.
uh,
Look,
because he didn't know what to say, how to react.
no, and one time
Mhm.
we had two choices. It was A or B,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I said, we have a problem, Jack, and we can do A or B. And Jack said, "I want you to do B."
Mhm.
And I said, "But that's the wrong thing to do. That will have a bad result." And he said, "I want you to do B. You must do B." And he kept hammering at me, and some of my staff was in the meeting. So when we went out into the hallway, they were all upset, and they said, "What are you going to do? You can't do B because it's going to ruin the project." And I said, "Well, of course I'm going to do A." And they said, "Yeah, but if you do that, you'll get fired because Jack ordered you to do B." And I said, "Jack doesn't order anybody to do anything. Jack orders people to follow their instincts and get the best results. Later on, I will tell him that I did A, and he won't even remember there was a B because A will turn out so good.
Perfect, perfect. So back to the question, why he still doesn't do interviews nowadays is because he had one those bad memories and those bad experience. Even though they were right, those paper reports about his bankruptcy,
No, that
he
wasn't the
still
main
was
reason. That was only the beginning and the
okay.
roots.
Uh-huh.
Let me give you another really great example. Now, there were many examples of this,
Mhm.
and I'm not going to say there was one because he was like a political. Now we have a political election in the United States,
Mhm.
and candidates are some are being treated better than others by the press, and the same thing with Jack. Let me tell you a very sad story.
Okay.
Um, Forbes magazine came to us and wanted to do an interview with Jack.
Mhm.
So Jack didn't want to do it, but I told him it would be good for the company and good for him, and I thought it would be fine, and he should start doing more interviews because he had that relationship that I told you about, and he had some bad experiences, not just in Canada but in many other places. So he said, okay, fine. So I made friends with the writer. I shepherded the writer around. I gave the writer carte blanche and gave him lots of access. We took pictures of Jack. We did a wonderful interview, and the writer sent me the story. The story was wonderful. It told the Commodore story and all the things we've succeeded because we were the number one.
Mhm.
We were the first million seller microcomputer, the VIC
Mhm.
20, and the Commodore 64
Mhm.
sold millions. We also did some other things. We did the first million seller telephone modem, and
Mhm.
we were the
Mhm.
largest telecomputing website. Before there was a web, we were the largest community on CompuServe, which was a telecommuting community where they answered questions, all verbal, using modems. And we did all these things, and all of these things were in the article. So I saw the article before it was published, and when the magazine came out, you won't believe what it said. The article was totally rewritten from what they had shown me.
Oh,
And
okay.
at the top of the article, they had a one-word heading, albatross. And they tried to make the case that Jack Tramiel, who was the founder of the company, the patent of the company, the Rommel of the company,
Mhm.
had was ruining the company, and they
Oh,
really spoke the
okay.
truth. And
Yeah,
it
of
was a
course.
horrible, scathing attack on Jack personally. And
Okay.
when I called the writer, and I asked him what the hell happened, I was livid because I was losing face because I had asked Jack to do this. I had even read the story, and I knew it was going to be positive. Guess what the writer told me? He said Malcolm Forbes, the editor of Forbes, he liked to invite chief executives to come out on his yacht, and he would invite two or three people on his yacht for the weekend to get to know them socially. Well, he sent a note to Jack, and Jack was too busy, so Jack apparently never even responded. He never responded yes or no. And in those days, we were all moving so fast, we
Mhm.
many times didn't respond to invitations like this. So apparently Jack never responded to Malcolm Forbes. Malcolm was so offended by this that he took revenge on Jack
Ooh.
Tramiel
Okay.
by because the writer said that he walked up behind him one day and he told him you have to change the story, and he told him how to change the story. He
Oh.
dictated a new story to him.
Okay.
It was horrible abuse of the press. It was just a horrible abuse of the press,
Mhm.
and it's a story that I carry with me. And as you can tell, I'm still resentful today because the
Mhm.
press shouldn't have that kind of power. The
Mhm.
press should be more ethical. And I must tell you that I'm not a huge fan of Malcolm Forbes because of that. The late
Mhm.
Malcolm Forbes. I like his son a lot, by the way. His son is terrific. But Malcolm Forbes, this is a
Mhm.
story that I know personally that was
Hmm.
very, very bad. So
Not
because
correct.
of that, Jack was totally soured on the press
Hmm.
after that.
So you don't think he will change his mind once again and make an interview?
I've heard a few people that were trying to talk to his son Sam, and
Samuel. Yeah, Samuel. Exact.
uh, and do something. By the way, I think a lot of people wonder why Jack left the company. in 1982,
Mm-hmm.
Texas Instruments was given a lot of publicity for being the number one home computer company, which was a false. We had a much larger market share than Texas Instruments, but nobody was giving us credit. We even knew the numbers, and we were just totally frustrated by that. So one day, we went to a convention, and we had a little tiny booth that cost about $100,000. Texas Instruments, which sold watches and calculators and other things, had a two-story $1 million booth, and they looked like they were beating us, and they weren't. We were selling more. So I told Jack, everybody was a little bit demoralized. We felt like we were in a little serf's hut next to the castle. And I had a lot of good friends at Texas Instruments, I must say. We were all very friendly in those days. The
Mm-hmm.
Apple people talked to the Commodore people.
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft let us use basic programming for our language. We had a lot of deals. We used to go and look at technology from Sony for LCD screens for our computers way before it was announced, and Seiko showed us things. Many of our competitors would share information with us behind closed doors, and
Mm-hmm.
this was very common in those early days. So I liked Texas Instruments a lot. But when I told Jack that everybody was demoralized because we knew we were beating them, but they looked more successful than we did. So Jack said, we're going to drive them out of the market. We're going to cut all of our software and peripherals costs in half, prices in half. Well, the reason we did that is because our engineers had also come to Jack and said, Texas Instruments is losing money on the CPU, on the computer. So they were losing money they couldn't make that computer for that price. But they were making it up on software and peripheral sales. So Jack said, we are making money on the computer. We
Mm-hmm.
have good connections in the Orient, in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
through the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm.
We did a lot of things that kept our costs lower, and we were making money, and they weren't. So all we had to do was cut our software prices in half. So that's what he did, and he announced it at this convention. Guess what happened? Within an hour, the president of the consumer computers came over, and he screamed at Jack and said, "You can't do this. It's not right. It's going to screw up the market." And Jack just smiled at him. So he went away. He got all of his staff on the plane, and he took them back to Texas while the convention was still in power. Are still in power. While the convention was still in force, and that Friday they announced, like only 3 days later, that they were exiting the home computer business.
Oh,
So
okay.
we drove them completely out of the home computer business. We wound up as the king of the mountain. We were number one in the market and the only home computer company standing. We were still
Mm-hmm.
competing with Apple and IBM clone PCs and people who were using Microsoft or people who were using Apple OS. But we were the number one home computer company. And the problem with that was that fall, all of the retailers started asking for stock balancing, which means many of them had bought their software at higher prices, higher costs than we were now retailing the software. They had actually paid more to buy the software at wholesale than we were now selling at retail because we cut all the prices in half. So we had to give a whole bunch of free products to our retail network, which included Kmart and JCPenney and many mass market retailers. So we had to give away a lot of free product, which hurt our profit margin. Of course, we took lower profits on the straight sales. And then that Christmas, Texas Instruments dumped its computers for like $80 a piece on the market, which further cut into our sales, and it hurt our quarter.
Ooh.
As a result of that, Irving Gould and the people who were on the board were a little bit dissatisfied because this is the first time we had a drop in our quarterly results for a couple of years. We had several stock splits. The stock price was soaring. I think the stock was about $90 a share, and it had gone up and split a couple of times. In fact, the first time Jack gave me stock options, he gave me 1,000 shares, And then he whispered in my ear, it's going to split in a couple of months, so you actually have 3,000 shares.
Woo.
So the deal was Jack had engineered a short-term financial hit in exchange for a long-term financial dominance in the
Mhm.
marketplace. It was very shrewd. It was a calculated risk. It was guaranteed to put us on top of the market for many years to come. But unfortunately, Irving Gould, the chairman of the board, and some of the investors were very sensitive. So just losing some stock price or some money in one quarter really raised alarm bells for them, and they became very panicky. The
Mhm.
second thing that scared them was and this relates to your question about Jack's son. The second thing that scared them was Jack wanted to bring his sons into the company as vice presidents and turn over the reins at some point. He wanted them to keep the heritage going. And by the way, this was a very smart thing to do because we had a unique culture of innovation, similar to Intel or GE or Apple. And to kill that culture would be to kill the company, as we
Mhm.
found out. So here's the neat thing: Jack had three very exceptionally talented sons. Leonard had worked in finance and banking. He was the youngest. Sam had worked in operations. In fact, Jack had sent him overseas to work in a Hong Kong assembly plant making watches and other components
Mhm.
so he could learn manufacturing and operations. Sam became an expert at this. Sam was more cut in his father's image than anyone, and he reminds me more of his father than any of the sons. He was tough-minded, rigorous, scrupulously
Mhm.
fair,
Mhm.
no
Mhm.
nonsense, just a terrific manager in any venue. Sam's just terrific. And then Leonard, I think Leonard's the oldest one. Leonard was kind of he was like the technical guru. He actually worked on the first Commodore PET when he was a student in college. He got a degree, earned a degree in New York in astrophysics. He had, I believe, two experiments on the space shuttle. He was absolutely technically brilliant, and between the three of them, you had a son who was an expert in finance and banking, a son who was an expert and experienced with hands-on experience in the Orient in operations, and you had a son who actually helped develop some of the first Commodore computers and was just technically ingenious. So that would have been an unbeatable combo. But of course, the chairman and a lot of people saw that as nepotism, and they thought that was not going to work, and that they didn't see the
Mhm.
rationale behind it. As a result, in in the board meeting at the end of 1983, at the end of December or first week in January, I think, they had a board meeting, and Jack walked in totally blindsided, and they announced that they were firing him. I understand that half of his stock would be purchased, and the rest he would sell in the market, and he would probably walk away with about $100 million or thereabouts. But the bottom line was that he was out,
Mhm.
and and the rationale that Irving Gould gave was that it was time for professional management,
Mhm.
and professional management meant management like IBM, which wouldn't work at Commodore. They they hired a gentleman from Europe named Marshall Smith. Marshall was the CEO of a company that bought Irving Gould's Interpol Container Company. Irving Gould had a company that he sold to a European company. The CEO of the European company came over to become CEO of Commodore,
Mhm.
and he was paid $1 million a year for 3 years in a row, despite the fact that Commodore lost money and the stock
Mhm.
plummeted. But he was paid off. It was like, I mean, it was almost like he was paid off $3 million because he engineered the purchase of Irving's Interpol shipping container company. So I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, but it was very
Mhm.
weird. And
Mhm.
the result was that it killed Commodore.
Mhm.
As a result, 6 months after Jack left, um, 35 top executives, including the president of the U.S. company, the semiconductor engineers, me, a lot of software engineers, and some managers. We all walked out of the company in 1 week in
Mhm.
May of 1984.
Mhm.
The people who were left at the company were mostly gray-haired old men from companies like Max Factor and Yvonne Picon and corporations that had nothing to do with computers. And the bottom line was they basically didn't know what they were doing. They thought that Commodore should become IBM.
Mhm.
They started selling IBM clones. Commodore became the biggest seller of IBM clones in Europe.
Mhm.
And Jack went on to, he was offered the chance to rescue Atari,
Mhm.
which had been losing money. Atari lost $1 billion in 5 years. I'm glad I didn't work for Atari. So Jack rescued Atari and turned it into a family company. And then Commodore went into what we call in business a death
Mhm. Mhm.
spiral.
Mhm.
Many of Commodore's general managers from Canada, even South Africa, took turns trying to run the company. None of them were as capable as Jack, and none of them could turn the company around.
Mhm.
And all of the genius was gone from the company.
Hmm. So what's your opinion about the development that has been done to computers after that? I mean, for example, there is that C128 that was announced as a three-in-one computer because it had CPM modes, C128 mode, 80 columns, and the CCC4 mode, but it wasn't so successful. What do you think about those things? Do you think that the engineers weren't so good at that time, or was it problem of the management? I mean, nowadays you still can see those people who are active as selling videos, for example. Even though I don't recall the name now, but there was this one C128 developer who did that video, the that Virgin or something, or the I don't really remember. But there is that DVD movie about the last day of Commodore. So do you still keep touch with them, or what do you think about their achievements? They
Let
brought
me
to
give you
Commodore.
let me give you explain that with a different perspective.
Mhm.
Let me contrast that what would have happened if Jack stayed as
Mhm.
what happened when he left.
Okay, sure.
It's a very simple comparison technologically.
Okay.
Let me give you an example. I noticed that telecomputing modems were all handset modems. You had to take the receiver of the telephone and put it on a little cup, on two little cups,
Mhm.
and that's how you did computing. And as a result, modems cost $400 or more in the 1980s.
Mhm.
So I said, we have an RS-232 built in. Let's do a direct connect, some kind of modem that costs $100. Now, in order to sell a modem for $100, it had to cost $33.
Mhm.
So you could have a three-time markup. Well, I went out and contracted. We didn't have enough engineering talent inside the company. So I contracted an outside firm of engineers who were doing infrared modems for warehouses
Mhm.
to design this with me. And we worked together, and finally they brought me the last design, and they said, we still can't get it down to the $33 price point, cost point, because we have to have a cord and a little cup to put the phone in. And I said, wait a minute, we have an RS-232 port on the computer. Why don't we put the mobile modem on a game cartridge, plug it into the port, and make a direct connect to the telephone? And they went, oh my God, and they ran away like a bunch of little meerkats on a Wild Africa movie. They all went running like little meerkats. That's it. And they all ran away, and the next day they came back and they had the design, and that was called the Vic modem, which
Uh-huh.
became the first million seller modem in the world. And that also allowed me to do something that we needed to have our customer service pick up steam because we had 1 million customers, more, just for the VIC 20 alone, not to mention the others. And so we couldn't handle all the inquiries. So I created something called the Commodore Information Network, which we put it on CompuServe, and this allowed users to talk to each other and answer each other's questions the way they do on the internet today. And at one day, Jack came running into my office waving a check at me, and I was a check for $35,000 from CompuServe. And he said, "What's this? What's this? Who's doing things behind my back that I don't know about at this level?" Because he knew if something was happening at the level of even $35,000 in $1 billion company, he literally knew about it. So he wanted to know what was going on, and I said, "You should be happy about that. That's the royalty payment from CompuServe, because the Commodore Information Network is the largest user community on CompuServe. CompuServe was a precursor to the internet, so I guess I can say I'm kind of an early internet style pioneer. It was a community, and they were answering each other's questions, and they were using this. I actually negotiated $107 worth of, or $190 worth of free computing time on Dow Jones, the Source, CompuServe, the telecomputing networks of the day. I negotiated that so that you had more value after you bought it than before you bought it. Well, here's the thing. That's the kind of stuff we were doing. The next computer we were going to do was called the Plus 4.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it was codenamed the Max.
Mm-hmm.
This was going to have all the software built in. We were going to hardwire the software into the computer, and we were going to have a word processor, a graphics package, a database, and a spreadsheet. And that was going to be in the computer, and then we would have a cartridge that would provide software updates.
Mm-hmm.
So all the software would be inside, which would make it run faster, more powerful, and it would be all of the applications that we now call apps. You know, there's 1 million apps on a cell phone. Well, those were the 4 main apps for home computers. So we were going to build them in. Well, as soon as Jack left, that computer was killed. The new computers lost most of the engineering talent, so they weren't as good as they should have been. The marketing became sort of very bland and unimaginative. And last but not least, we bought our next computer generation outside, which was called the Amiga.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And
Yeah.
the Amiga was bought for $23 million, which they overpaid for that. They did not require the engineers who invented it to stay with the company and do new generations. Um, they kind of blew it, and although it was a wonderful computer, they didn't follow through because they didn't have the infrastructure left inside the company to make it happen. And the company was being run by a bunch of gray-haired old men, which I'm now past 60 and I have gray hair, so I guess I'm talking about myself. But when I say gray-haired old men, it's a mindset. It's I mean, there were people with who didn't have gray hair who acted like old men after Jack left. I mean, there are people who get it and people who don't.
Mm-hmm.
People in the current internet generation, they get it. People who don't get it, you can tell who they are. They don't use the internet. They don't get the most out of it. They follow old practices. They're not innovative, and
Mm-hmm.
their companies kind of stagnate. And that's why I stay involved in innovation at the Wharton School, where I work
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I keep my finger in emerging technologies, and I'm always
Mm-hmm.
looking at the cutting edge, and I'm very happy and lucky to be where I am today.
Mm-hmm. So you that's a very detailed answer. So you worked around it kind of. So you say you appreciate what the engineers are doing, but it was the company management and that different way of leading the company that kind of destroyed everything. Is that correct so
Absolutely.
far? Okay.
Absolutely.
And what do you think about the Commodore USA, which is nowadays trying to make a PC selling that looks like a C64 in the black box? Did you see that
Well,
actually?
yes, I think. that it's always kind of interesting when somebody takes a legacy technology
Mhm.
and tries to capitalize on a brand.
Mhm.
When I was when I was getting my MBA at UCLA in California,
Mhm.
I remember somebody said there was a famous toothpaste called Ipana,
Mhm.
IPANA, which has a symbol of a little beaver.
Uh-huh.
And the brand went out of business and they stopped making it. But many years later, somebody else brought it back and they started making Ipana. And sometimes if you go into a store that sells candy, you'll see old-fashioned candy from 50 or 100 years ago, and
Mhm.
they bring it back because people still want it. Well, the same thing with Commodore. I think people tried to bring back the Commodore brand. They
Mhm.
tried to bring back other brands, and it's worthwhile, but it's not the same.
Okay, it's not the same. Okay, so do you think it's wrong to try to get most of the brand and kind of re-releasing the 64? I mean there has been some re-releases. I mean the DTV, for example, which is a C64 in a joystick, which was pretty successful and actually actually designed by Jerry Ellsworth, who is, as you probably know, a hardware designer. She spent all her money and even stopped working just to develop the Commodore 1 computer. So what do you think about those kinds of how you say how you would say it dedication? I mean that you really dedicate your life to get the 64 back and getting the hardware redesigned from scratch.
Well, first of all, I'm always amazed,
Mhm.
totally amazed and humbled by the number of legacy software sites and websites and magazines that
Mhm.
are keeping history alive
Mhm.
and that try to keep the legacy of Commodore alive. Apparently, the culture of innovation that we created and the electricity
Mhm.
and the market presence and all of the vibrancy that came from the company and its products lingers on. I think it's an incredible tribute to everyone at Commodore that there's so much talk and activity around Commodore products, legacy systems, trying to reinvent and update the systems. I just think this gives you a small glimpse of what it would happen if Jack had been allowed to stay at the company and keep it going.
Mhm.
We would have been at least as good as Apple is today or Microsoft. We would have been in that family.
Mhm.
And apparently, it's just a travesty that Irving Gould, the chairman,
Mhm.
literally killed his own company. Literally, when he
Mhm.
was so worried about the stock price because of taking a financial hit one quarter because we drove Texas Instruments, our prime competitor, out of the market.
Mhm.
Instead of focusing on that, he focused on other things, and he was so concerned about stock price
Mhm.
that he killed the golden goose.
Mhm.
And guess what happened? About 6 months later, the stock price had fallen from $90 a share to $6 a share.
Mhm.
He killed the golden goose. And now you can see how valuable a property that was because people are still trying to resurrect it, to keep it alive, and they're wondering, where is all the electricity? Now, I have to tell you honestly,
Mhm.
I have moved on, way far on from Commodore, in that what I'm more interested in now is avatars,
Mhm.
iTablets, smartphones with a million apps. If I get lost, I can now use the GPS that's built into my telephone to go places. All of this had its roots in Commodore home computing
Mhm.
because we introduced the
Mhm.
world to the concept of home computing. We made computers friendly. We called them friendly. We don't take credit for all of it, but we helped a lot. We got like the first million people to own a home computer,
Mhm.
uh, to use it with a television set, to learn how to type, you learn how to do a little programming.
That's true.
Now, I don't program BASIC anymore. I used to, but now I program a little XTML, and I program a little bit on my personal website if I
Mhm.
need it, if I need to fix something. And I think a lot of people program in HTML. Look at the number of websites around.
Mhm.
Look at the user communities that we had,
Mhm.
one of the first user communities that help each other solve problems. I still play video games. My favorite video game is Modern Warfare, and I operate at the multi prestige level, and I love being an avatar in a movie
Mhm.
just like that. In 1980, when I gave my keynote speech with Bill Gates at the CES show, I predicted that one day
Mhm.
famous actors, who would be after they were dead, such as John Wayne. And I used John Wayne as an example. And I said someday, after John Wayne is dead, they'll still make movies about with John Wayne by digitizing them. And I
Mhm.
predicted that in 1982. And a couple of years ago, somebody did a beer commercial with John Wayne, and they actually did that.
Mhm.
There are a lot of things that we started and we were talking about have come to pass. And I think right this minute, we're poised to do something dramatically different.
Mhm.
We will do more with avatars than
Mhm.
anyone can
Mhm.
imagine. We are starting to translate computer activity into mechanical activity.
Mhm.
And let me
Mhm.
give you a great example. You know, one of the first examples was building cars with robots. If you ever saw a robot factory building cars,
Mhm. Of
you
course I did.
swear you're watching a science fiction movie because those big arms are running around drilling these little tiny screws and rivets in this big car. You know, it's amazing. But if you look closer, you can see in some movies people have exoskeletons. They have skeletons that are just basically flexible tubes on the outside of your body that allow you to lift 200 pounds and run with 200 pounds. And I saw an exoskeletons last year made by Lockheed Martin that are used by soldiers. This year the same type of exoskeleton is helping paraplegics and paralyzed people walk, which is very important because so many people were paralyzed or lost their limbs in the wars in the Middle East.
Mhm.
So that's become a big deal, and I see exoskeletons actually being used to help those people walk, and those are computer generated things. I think gene therapy is just starting to happen, and the only reason we have any gene therapy is because of all the computing power. I see that Intel continues to keep Moore's Law moving ahead, and we had some presentations by Intel at Wharton in the last couple of years that assured us that Moore's Law is going to keep going, which means our computers will be more powerful, more intelligent, more pervasive, and at some point you will have uh, intelligent robots and better artificial intelligence simply because we'll be able to do more pattern matching. The whole thing about having an intelligent robot, like you being a robot or me being a robot, you have to have so much speed and so much power that you can do pattern matching to look at all the meanings of all the idioms and all the words and even different languages to make that robot intelligent because we're constantly comparing things
Mhm.
and a
Mhm.
computer can't do that unless
Yeah,
it has
it's true.
immense power. So I see a lot of things happening that came from what we started in home computing,
Mhm.
and I'm excited about the future. I do what Jack Tramiel said that he does. I definitely live in the future, and that's what my orientation is.
So you're not so much into retro computing, which is a hype that grew up like, especially like in the last 3 years. Everything is riding that retro wave, like, hey, old computers, old video game consoles, and
Well, I'm into what we call at the Wharton School. I'm in the Mac Center where I work. Our faculty studies strategies and best practices for managing innovation,
mhm,
and our client companies and our partner companies are organizations like NASA,
mhm,
Lockheed Martin,
mhm.
most of the pharmaceutical companies, Merck, Medtronic, companies like that, Sanofi Aventis, and So basic and handling big data in enterprise systems. So I'm all about radical innovation today. I'm about what will change the game, what will transform the
Mhm.
market, what
Mhm.
will create risk and uncertainty, what do we have to gamble on to get big payoffs. That's what I'm all about right now. I work with companies doing that. Whether it's a cement company that wants to put nanotubes into the cement to make it more durable and flexible, or whether it's a high-tech company that's trying to design a new spacecraft.
Mhm.
Radical innovations are going to change our lives and also solve the problems like global warming. We have to be investing in these radical innovations.
But then you are still willing to share your experience about the past. And I mean, the fact that your book Computer Wars is so expensive nowadays and so hard to get and so much wanted must be a sign that you're really into that IT stuff and into the market stuff, and you really had an influence on everything. I mean, that makes you a little famous in some way. I mean, you
Well,
even
I
have your
have to.
own. You even have your own Wikipedia article. I mean,
Yeah, that's very flattering. I never thought I'd have that. I had very humble beginnings. I grew up with
mhm,
a single parent. My mother was a singer in the
mhm,
1940s, and then she went into nursing. My mother's still alive. She's 89 years old.
mhm,
I grew up in a small town, Oshkosh, Wisconsin,
mhm,
in the Midwest, and I realized that I was in a small town and I wanted to break out and do something bigger. So whenever I prayed, I would pray, please God, let me do something significant with my life.
mhm,
That's all I asked for, and I think I did it. I want to keep doing it.
mhm. And did you keep an eye on the people that became kind of known and famous because of the computer you built? For example, Jeroen Tel from the Netherlands or Chris Hülsbeck from Germany, who actually moved to USA to make music for computer games and stuff. I mean those two people, they are still in business, and those are the two most known still active game composers.
Well, actually, there's a line of thought that goes like this. Not only did Jack Tramiel develop the first computers for the masses, not the classes, so that everybody could afford a computer, but he also taught a whole bunch of people, myself included, the skills and the unique capabilities that we needed to keep doing interesting things. I've been
Mhm.
at the Wharton School studying and promoting and
Mhm.
championing innovation for 17 years.
Mhm.
Other people have done things in developing products and all kinds of things that we don't even see because some of them do it behind the scenes.
Mhm.
So I think the legacy of Jack Tramiel and Commodore stretches far beyond the
Mhm.
technology, and it expresses itself in the people like
Mhm.
myself
Mhm.
and what we learned and how we apply it in our lives and what we've done after we left Commodore.
Mhm. Mhm. And
You
how?
mentioned
Yeah. Yeah. Um. Actually, did you speak to those famous Commodore people or people who became known? Um. For example, the Fender Tucker, who is also called Mr. Lodestar, which made the Lodestar magazine, the first disc magazine actually, and the longest running one for the C64. Did you ever speak to those people? Did you have a conversation with those
No,
people? Or?
I mostly kept to my own
Okay,
group here and there. I actually formed new relationships. I have a
okay,
network of probably 2,500 people that are friends through the Wharton School, and
okay.
another 800 people on LinkedIn that are
Mhm.
sort of non-Wharton friends.
Okay.
Um, and I have to tell you that the people that I know are mostly pioneers, like the founder of some of the internet web
Mhm.
started his
Mhm.
own game company, which is
Mhm.
very successful. So Neil Harris has a wonderful game company that he runs. Yeah, I saw Yash Terakura, who was the Japanese engineer from Japan that did the VIC-20 firmware. By the way, Yash Terakura, the first time I saw him, he was a long-haired Japanese. He looked
Mhm.
like a Japanese hippie, and I told him that the prime directive was this had to be a user-friendly computer. And when I told him that, he looked up at me and smiled and he said, "Of course, this will be a user-friendly computer. I am a user-friendly
Hmm.
engineer." And I had dinner with him a couple months ago, and we it was just like we were two old friends. From 30 years ago, and he's just as cool as he ever was. And I hope we all are.
Okay. Okay, so but still you know who they are when you hear their names, like Fender Tucker or Jeruntel or something. You know who they are, basically.
I am insatiable when it comes to technology and
Mhm.
reading about people and what they're doing. I probably know more about people that I don't communicate well with, but I
Mhm.
know what they're doing and I keep track of who's doing what and where, and I'm very impressed. And like I said, I think the legacy is extraordinary.
Mhm.
What came out of Commodore, and many people don't know about the legacy.
Mhm. And what is your opinion about some computer industry history books who actually say that Apple was the first company who made those home computers, even though it was Commodore?
Well, Commodore was the first company to sell the VIC-20 was the first microcomputer of any kind to sell 1 million units.
Mhm.
Commodore was the first company to reach $1 billion in
Mhm.
annual sales, as a personal computer company. However, let's face it, Apple survived. Apple
Mm.
did things right. Apple almost went bankrupt a couple times, or almost went down a couple times. Steve Jobs was allowed, remember, Steve Jobs was allowed to remain at the helm of Apple, and look what it became, and God bless Steve Jobs.
Hmm.
Bill Gates was allowed to remain at the helm of Microsoft, and look what it became, God bless Bill Gates.
Hmm.
Jack Tramiel was not allowed to remain at the helm of Commodore,
Hmm.
and Commodore went out of business. Now, what does that tell you? I will not take anything away from Apple. I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
Steve Jobs' legacy is etched in gold for all eternity. By the way.
Actually, there is something. There was an article in German computer media which I read that said that now Apple is trying to pay to take that management style from Steve to his successors, though that Apple won't face the same problem Commodore had when Jack Tramiel left.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but what I read about Apple is they're going to try to run it by a committee, and that doesn't work very well. You need an indomitable,
Mhm.
motivated visionary to force innovation.
Mhm.
I don't think innovation happens serendipitously, although occasionally it does. I think it is driven by visionaries. And when the visionaries die, we lament their loss. And it's very, very hard to find a new
Mm.
Einstein
Mm.
or a new Steve Jobs or another Jack Tramiel. It's very hard to,
Mm.
those people are rare.
Mm.
And the fact that Jack was forced out of his own company was a tragedy,
Mm.
and it really was a loss for technology. What would happen if we had a Steve Jobs and a Bill Gates and a Jack Tramiel, plus all the other people who did the internet and so many other nice things?
Mhm.
You know?
So you don't give Apple much chances to survive now that Steve is not there anymore.
Pardon me, I didn't get that one.
I mean, so you don't give Apple a good chance to survive any longer since Steve is no longer there, or do you think there might be a chance? I mean they
No,
have.
I don't. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not
Uh-huh.
saying that at all. What I'm saying is that the culture will inevitably change.
Mhm.
The fact that Steve was allowed to put his mark on the company for such a long time probably means that people will remember him and how he would do things, and they will act accordingly for many years to come, and hopefully
Okay.
decades. Just like Intel
Mhm.
and some other companies, where in GE, for example, I think GE um, carries the tradition of Jack Welch and many other GE leaders that went before them. I think companies like Procter and Gamble,
Mhm.
those companies carry the legacy, IBM, of a very distinguished chain of remarkable CEOs and visionaries. And Steve Jobs was the first at Apple, but he probably won't be the last, I
Mhm.
hope.
Mhm.
I think just having set the bar so high,
Mhm.
it means that Apple will now have to do things to keep that bar high, and I think they will. I really do.
Mhm. So you will continue playing around with apps, as you mentioned it before, that you are preferring to stay on the latest technology.
Well, I just had an interesting conversation yesterday with head of software engineering at Intel, who's
Okay.
working on iTablets now, and we had a fascinating conversation about iTablets. And I've been working with several other companies. I'm kind of an off and on sounding board here and there for friends around that ask me to give my opinion, and I still stay current with cutting edge
Mhm.
technologies
Mhm.
and what I think are the possibilities. I'm one of those people who has ability to see many possibilities ahead, and I say, well, here are your choices, and then we talk about that. So
Mhm.
I champion technology. I really think that all of the problems that plague us, from global warming to war, are can be addressed by radical new innovations that we haven't seen yet.
Mhm.
And the faster the pace of technology, the more intense the effort, the higher the investment,
Mhm.
uh, the better chance we have not only to solve our problems but to survive as a human race.
Mhm.
Because people think we are going to exist until the sun burns out. That's
Mhm.
not true. People think we are going to exist for hundreds of millions of years, but let's be real. The Roman civilization, the Mayan civilization, the Egyptian civilization, the Greek civilization, the even all of the great civilizations of the past collapsed in a very short space of time historically. It didn't take them thousands of years to collapse. They collapsed in a, due to something that happened in like a 10-year period or a 50-year period or a 100-year period. We are in one of those periods now where
Mhm.
civilization could be severely threatened. I mean, if we lose the ice caps, the Arctic ice cap has lost what, something like 30% of its mass. I just got a master's degree. I earned a master's degree in environmental studies last year, and I studied some of these things because they concern me. And I must tell you that we don't have till the sun burns out or till the Earth
Hmm.
changes polar axes or something. We don't have that much time. Global warming is real.
Mhm.
And if you think global warming isn't happening, then you can look at the melting of the ice caps because it's very well documented. But let me tell you something else. Let me tell you one reason we should think about global warming. There was a study done in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in office buildings that were poorly ventilated and the CO2 levels that accumulated in those buildings. When those buildings reached 550 parts per million of CO2 in the office atmosphere, people started complaining about having difficulty breathing. That was well documented. When I started studying environmental technologies 4 years ago, we were at about 380 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. We are now up to 391 or 392 parts per million. By the end of the century, we could be up to 550 parts per million. Now, if you get up to 550 parts per million and you walk outside, you know what that means? When you go outside and take a deep breath of fresh air, you're going to complain that you have difficulty breathing fresh air. That alone is enough to get
Hmm.
everybody interested in doing this.
Hmm.
If you don't care about your grandchildren or great grandchildren suffocating in the next 100 years, then I guess we can keep burning coal and fossil fuels
Mhm.
and all the things we're doing. But this is a dangerous time for civilization, and I don't want to be an alarmist, but it doesn't take much for a civilization to collapse. One of the things that makes a civilization collapse is when the government starts fighting with itself all the time. Which, I won't say anything about that, but you can draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Technology, we have a bright future ahead. Technology can solve not all of our problems, but many of them, and it
Hmm.
also introduces new problems. But I remain an innovation champion, and till the end of my life, I will be an innovation champion. And my interest in innovation was spawned at Commodore, and it remains as lively as ever.
Hmm.
And I thank you very much for inviting me to do this interview and share some of my thoughts.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us.